people always bring up the question about the nudity in the film, and so the photographer said, well, if what we've said or what they read about being emotionally honest, you know, why we didn't cut away, why the nudity is part of the integral in the storytelling, would I allow myself to be photographed nude if I was going to be honest about what I said? So I thought about it, and I called Larry in New York, and he said, I don't want to see you nude. Are you crazy? And then I talked to a friend, Jan Rolls, a production designer that works in the States, and you know, I've worked with a Dutch artist, and he said I was crazy and he wouldn't do it. And then when I hung up, I said, I'll do it, you know. So it was just a fun way to be in Rotterdam. It's about growing up. It's about the adolescents growing up, and it's about the parents growing up, and it's about emotional dependency and how sometimes as adults we can take out our dark side, our own limitations and frustrations on our loved ones and our young ones. And it's how the young people, how adolescents cope with the adult world. And we've always said if Kids is a look into the kids' world, Ken Park is a look into the parents' world through the kids. So it's really about how people, through their limitations, frustrations, use their needs, emotional needs, and take it out on other people. We're all victims in a way. I mean, we're not trying to say the adult world is a bad world and the youth is a good world. We're trying to show that people are vulnerable and these things happen. I think what we're trying to say is some kids are going to make it and some don't. You know, there's a Tate character that is involved in a violent crime, and Ken Park that's like the bookend structure for the film that commits suicide. But the other kids are in that last scene with the three of them. The hope is they talk about their dream to get out of this town, this small town. It could be any small town. It could be any small town mentality anywhere. And the hope is that they will. Some will, some won't. I think Tate is someone like a lot of people, like maybe, I don't know, people you know, that don't fit into an environment because he's probably the most intelligent, highly creative person, and he doesn't have any outlet for it. And you see the one scene when he's outside with kids, you know, the skip rope girls, and you see where he can be a kid, but he's obviously been abandoned because he's living with his grandparents, he's very angry, and there's no outlet for him to deal with his anger. And unfortunately, his grandparents don't have the emotional tools to deal with him, and they're lovely, warm, loving people, but they just don't have a way to communicate with each other. How this all came about is I met Larry about 10 years ago in Graz, Austria at an art festival. And Larry's work in two books, he was a photographer, still is, in Teenage Lust in Tulsa, and Robert Frank's book, The Americans, were the reasons I even got interested in cinematography and photography. And I told him at this dinner, I said, your books read and like a story, like a film, you know, between the images and within the images, they're telling stories. Had he ever thought about making a film? And he said, hey man, I always wanted to make a film, but how do you make a film? And I said, oh, it's easy, let's just hang out. And I found out he was interested in skaters, skateboarders, and I was a skater when I was younger. And I said, did he keep any diaries outside of a visual diary that these books were, but also any written diaries? And he said he had. And so I said, well, let's take stories out of your diaries and then update it in a sense. Let's hang out in skate parks like with a high-aid video camera and meet kids and find their own stories. And so we did this, and we got all this material together, and then Larry and I said, well, we need a writer to write this with. And he met Harmony in Washington Square Park. And just coincidentally, I met Harmony, or knew Harmony, from Light Sleeper. He was a production assistant on a film that I shot for Paul Schrader. So we gave him all the material. He was like 19 years old at the time, and he wrote this script. And then it took me about 10 years. And I actually finally got money from a Dutch producer, Kees Cassander from Rotterdam, and he found the money in France, and here we are. My original intention was to help Larry make his first film, because I was in the process of making it my first film. And in the end, it's reversed. He's helped me make my first film. So yes, he went off and did Kids, and Harmony wrote that script, and did 2 other films, and I went off and did my thing, and then we said, hey, we should do this. We shouldn't let it go any further, you know, time-wise. And by then it was a little easier to get any kind of recognition and money to make the film, because there was some kind of track record with Larry, and people knew me. So just the timing wasn't right at the time. Larry and I always wanted Final Cut, and the material, I think, was always too challenging for an American producer, because they're always thinking about, you know, how they're going to sell it, you know, and how this will be limited in their market because of the explicit material in it. Unfortunately, we don't make a distinction. I mean, that's what the film was made for, about healthy and nurturing sex and predatory or self-destructive use of sex, and our emotional needs being an example of how, you know, we malign each other. So, I mean, that's the point of the film. And so, you know, in America, you know, I think sex only happens behind closed doors when the lights are out, and it was a mistake. So we certainly don't have a real dialogue about it, other than having, you know, an incredible large pornographic industry. And for me, if, you know, people ask me, is this pornography or not? I always say, well, my interpretation of pornography is, does it arouse or titillate the viewer? And in no way this film arouses or titillates the viewer. If anything, it kind of turns you off to what, you know, the uses of sex are. It isn't there to exploit. We've overused the whole idea of what the dogma or cinema verite style represents. You know, I came out of documentaries. I started with the Maisel brothers, and it was always a necessity to shoot that way in a documentary. But I never tried to make it look bad because I was shooting a documentary. And so now what's happened is people think, oh, if I'm going to tell a dramatic story, if I tell it with the tools of how documentaries are shot and manipulate it that way, that people are going to believe the emotional context of the stories because it's handhold or rough or available light. And for me, that's offensive, because I find it a violation of why we did it, and that you can show emotional honesty through observation without using a handheld camera. So I very clearly wanted to make a distinction in this film, and not, I say, ghettoize it in something called, you know, radical chic, you know, gritty look, or heroin chic, you know, whatever the term is, because you see it in commercials, in fashion photography now. And so I wanted to give respect to the performance, almost the way films were shot in the 60s and 70s in Eastern Europe, where it's kind of more observational, follows the action with the camera. I'm making choices with the camera while I'm shooting, you know, what I'm looking at while they're in their dialogues and in their emotion. You know, I like sometimes pan off to a hand or some object in the room relating to. So for me, that was more respectful to the performance and showing the performance in real time, not manipulating it by cutting. So you really believe that performance.